This is the story of how the world's reserve currency loses its crown and why most people don't see it happening until it's too late. Right now in 2026, the US dollar is following the exact same trajectory that destroyed the British pound's dominance 70 years ago, and the warning signs are everywhere if you know where to look. The dollar still holds 56.9% of global reserves as of the third quarter of 2025, according to IMF data, which sounds dominant until you realize that's down from 71% in 1999. What most people miss is that gradual decline is about to accelerate, because we've seen this movie before and the ending never changes. Between 1900 and 1976, the British pound went from being the world's undisputed reserve currency to requiring an IMF bailout just to stay afloat, a transition that took about 50 years. Every single mistake Britain made during that decline, America is making right now. What's actually happening to the dollar today is more complicated than the headlines suggest, because on the surface, dollar dominance looks untouchable. The Bank for International Settlements reports the dollar is involved in 89.2% of all foreign exchange transactions. SWIFT data from August 2024 shows the dollar at 49.1% of international payments, which is actually a 12-year high, and about 54% of global trade is invoiced in dollars, even though the US only represents 10% of world trade. But here's what's happening beneath those impressive numbers. China held $1.316 trillion in US Treasury securities back in November 2013, and by March 2025 that had fallen to $765 billion, which means they've reduced their exposure by over $550 billion without selling it all at once, because crashing the market serves nobody's interests. They've been quietly, methodically reducing their exposure for over a decade, while most Americans weren't paying attention. The money didn't just disappear either, because they're accumulating gold instead. Official Chinese central bank reserves reached 2,305 tons by November 2025, which means gold now represents 8.3% of China's reserves compared to below 3% just a few years ago. And some analysts looking at customs data think the real number could be over 5,000 tons that aren't being reported. This is exactly what smart money does when they see a currency in long-term decline, because you don't short it and create panic, you just slowly rotate into something else and wait. To understand where the dollar is headed, you need to understand what happened to the pound, and the parallels are almost eerie once you see them. Back in 1900, the British pound was everything the dollar is today and then some. It comprised about 62% of global reserves, nearly 90% of global foreign-denominated debt was in pounds, over 60% of world trade was invoiced in sterling, and Britain was the world's largest creditor nation, with the global financial center and the military superpower all wrapped into one. The sun never set on the British Empire, or so they said. World War I changed everything. British national debt exploded from 650 million to 7.7 billion between 1914 and 1918, which was almost a 12-fold increase. And debt to GDP surged from around 30% to 130% because only 25% of war costs were covered by taxation, while the rest was borrowed. In 1925, Chancellor Winston Churchill made what would later be seen as a catastrophic decision when he returned Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate of $1 to $4.86, even though economists including John Maynard Keynes warned the pound was overvalued by about 10% and would make British exports uncompetitive. Keynes published an essay called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, where he estimated the decision caused 700,000 additional unemployed. But Churchill pushed ahead anyway. 6 years later, on September 21, 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard permanently after more than $200 million had fled London in months of speculative attacks. Sterling immediately fell 25%, dropping to $3.37 by December, and this was the moment everyone knew the pound would never be the same. World War II delivered the final death blow. Britain was transformed from the world's largest creditor to its largest debtor, liquidating over $14 billion in foreign investments to pay for the war and receiving $31.4 billion in Lend-Lease supplies, which was essentially America financing Britain's survival. After the war, Britain had to borrow another $4.9 billion from the US and Canada, a loan that wasn't fully repaid until December 29, 2006, and debt to GDP peaked at 270%, which was the highest level in British history. July 1944 brought the moment of official demotion when representatives from 44 nations met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and established the US dollar as the world's reference currency, fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. The pound's era was over. Britain kept trying to maintain the illusion though. A devaluation in 1949 cut the pound by 30.5% from $4.03 to $2.80. And then 1956 brought the Suez Crisis, which was the geopolitical humiliation that made Britain's subordination unmistakable. When Britain tried to retake the Suez Canal, the US blocked IMF credit and threatened to dump sterling holdings, which meant Britain lost over $200 million in reserves in November alone and was forced to withdraw with its tail between its legs. Prime Minister Harold Wilson devalued again in 1967, this time by 14.3% from $2.80 to $2.40, and he went on television to tell the British people that the pound in their pocket or purse or in their bank hadn't been devalued. That phrase became infamous because everyone knew it was a lie the moment he said it. The final humiliation came in 1976 when sterling collapsed from $2 to $1.65, forcing Britain to request a $3.9 billion IMF loan, which was the largest in IMF history at that time and came with brutal austerity conditions attached. From peak dominance around 1900 to IMF bailout in 1976 took about 75 years. But the real collapse from Bretton Woods formalizing the dollar's dominance in 1944 to Britain's reserve share falling from 55% to 10% took just 26 years. What historians now understand is that the decline accelerates once confidence starts to crack, and confidence is everything in reserve currency status. America today is repeating the pattern with disturbing precision. US national debt reached $38.4 trillion in December 2025, with debt to GDP standing at 122 to 124%, which is comparable to Britain after World War I. But the number that should terrify you is the interest payments on that debt, which reached $981 billion in October 2025. That's nearly triple the $345 billion paid just 5 years earlier, and interest on the debt now exceeds defense spending. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt reaching 106% of GDP by 2027, which matches the World War II high for publicly held debt, then 116% by 2034, and potentially 200% by 2047, which is the level that preceded sterling's collapse. Manufacturing has disappeared just like it did in Britain. US manufacturing fell from 28.1% of GDP in 1953 to approximately 10% today, while manufacturing employment dropped from 19.6 million in 1979 to 12.76 million in December 2024, which is a loss of nearly 7 million jobs. Britain experienced the same trajectory, falling from over 25% of GDP to under 9% today. And both countries shifted from being exporters to running chronic trade deficits that never seem to end. The US goods trade deficit reached a record $1.21 trillion in 2024, with the China deficit at $295.5 billion, and Britain similarly shifted from net exporter to persistent importer during its decline, with chronic balance of payments crises becoming the defining economic feature of the 1960s and 70s. Military overextension tells the same story. The US maintains approximately 750 military installations across more than 80 countries, with 243,048 personnel overseas as of March 2025, and the post-9/11 wars cost an estimated $8 trillion, according to Brown University's Costs of War project, with almost all of it financed through debt rather than taxes. Britain's inability to maintain its global military presence while servicing war debts was a key factor in its decline, and the East of Suez withdrawal announcement in 1968 marked the moment Britain accepted it was no longer a superpower. If you want to pinpoint when America's decline shifted into higher gear, look at 2020 and what happened with money creation. The Federal Reserve's pandemic response dwarfed every previous intervention in history, expanding the Fed balance sheet from approximately $4.2 trillion in early 2020 to nearly $9 trillion by the first quarter of 2022, which more than doubled in 2 years and exceeded all 3 previous quantitative easing programs combined. M2 money supply, which is basically the amount of dollars in circulation, surged from approximately $15 trillion in early 2020 to $22 trillion at its peak, for a 47% increase in roughly 2 years. For context, it had taken 20 years from 2000 to 2020 for M2 to grow from $5 trillion to $15 trillion, which means they created in 2 years what previously took 2 decades. The fiscal side was even more staggering with the CARES Act in March 2020 at $2.2 trillion, PPP enhancement in April at $484 billion, consolidated appropriations in December 2020 at $900 billion, and the American Rescue Plan in March 2021 at $1.9 trillion for total COVID relief of approximately $5 trillion. Direct stimulus payments alone totaled around $814 to $931 billion across 3 rounds, while PPP loans reached $793 billion to 11.5 million businesses, with $755 billion ultimately forgiven. The consequences were inevitable and arrived right on schedule. CPI inflation peaked at 9.1% in June 2022, which was the highest in 40 years, and cumulative inflation from 2020 to 2024 reached approximately 22 to 25%, representing a corresponding reduction in dollar purchasing power that everyone could feel in their wallets. China took a completely different approach during COVID, with Chinese M2 growing at approximately 10 to 12% annually during the same period, far more restrained than America's 27% peak, because China focused on supply-side policies rather than direct consumer stimulus, which resulted in lower inflation. When the dollar and yuan are competing to be the world's reserve currency, inflation rates matter more than most people realize. Can the Chinese yuan actually replace the dollar right now? No. And here's why that's both true and misleading at the same time. The yuan comprises just 1.93% of global reserves as of the third quarter of 2025, which is actually down from 2.7% in 2022, and it ranks 5th behind the dollar, euro, yen, and pound, while in SWIFT payments the yuan fluctuates between 3 and 4.7%. Those statistics look like the yuan is nowhere close to challenging dollar dominance. But here's what those numbers miss completely. China isn't trying to replace the dollar in the traditional way because they're building parallel infrastructure instead. China's cross-border interbank payment system, called CIPS, processed 8.2 million transactions worth 175.49 trillion yuan, or about $24.5 trillion in 2024, which is up from 96.7 trillion yuan in 2022. And CIPS now connects 1,290 financial institutions across 121 countries. What's happening in actual trade tells the real story, because Russia-China trade shows what's possible when countries commit to de-dollarization. Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov stated in January 2025 that 99.1% of bilateral trade is now settled in rubles and yuan, compared to less than 2% before the 2022 sanctions, and bilateral trade between them reached a record $245 to $250 billion in 2024. India and Russia conduct approximately 90% of trade in national currencies now. Brazil established yuan real direct settlement mechanisms in 2023, and Saudi Arabia signed a $6.98 billion currency swap with China in November 2023 before joining the mBridge digital currency platform in June 2024. BRICS expanded to 10 members by adding Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and UAE in January 2024, plus Indonesia in 2025. And at the Kazan summit in October 2024, they demonstrated a prototype payment system designed to bypass SWIFT and dollar settlement entirely. The critical constraint preventing the yuan from becoming a true reserve currency is China's capital controls, because the Federal Reserve notes China's capital account remains semi-closed with strict controls on cross-border flows. Back in 2015 to 2016, when the PBOC unexpectedly changed its exchange rate mechanism, it triggered massive capital outflows that scared Beijing into keeping the controls in place. But those same controls prevent the yuan from achieving true reserve currency status. China can't replace the dollar in the traditional sense, but here's the thing, they don't need to. They're creating a parallel system for countries that want to trade outside dollar dominance, and the sanctions on Russia accelerated that process by years or maybe decades. The experts are deeply divided on what happens next, and their track records should make you cautious about anyone claiming certainty, because predictions about currency collapse have a terrible success rate. Ray Dalio of Bridgewater Associates warned in January 2025 that a debt-death spiral is that part of the cycle when the debtor needs to borrow money in order to pay debt service, and it accelerates. He noted the dollar fell 39% against gold in 2025 and recommends a 10 to 15% portfolio allocation to gold as protection against what he sees coming. Peter Schiff has been even more dramatic with his prediction that King Dollar's reign is coming to an end and gold will take the throne as the primary central bank reserve asset, telling people to prepare for a historic economic collapse. Schiff has been predicting dollar collapse since at least 2010 though, so his track record is mixed at best. Nouriel Roubini, who correctly predicted the 2008 crisis, says a bipolar currency regime would replace the dollar's exorbitant privilege within the next decade. The Federal Reserve maintains a different view in their July 2025 report, stating that the preeminent role of the US dollar in the global economy has been supported by the size and strength of the US economy, its stability and openness to trade and capital flows, and strong property rights and the rule of law. Barry Eichengreen, who is probably the world's leading academic authority on reserve currencies, argues the most likely outcome is a multipolar system with dollar, euro, and eventually UN coexisting rather than dollar collapse, meaning shared dominance over coming decades instead of any single currency failing. The IMF's analysis from June 2024 found that statistical tests do not indicate an accelerating decline in the dollar's reserve share, and they note the decline is going to non-traditional currencies like the Australian dollar, Canadian dollar, and Nordic currencies rather than primarily to the yuan or euro. JP Morgan's 2025 analysis concluded that, despite the potential for further weakness, the dollar's reserve currency status remains intact due to its trustworthiness and the lack of a viable alternative. Lawrence Summers memorably summarized the alternatives problem when he said Europe is a museum, Japan is a nursing home, and China is a jail, which captures why the dollar still dominates despite all its problems. Reserve currency transitions don't happen like market crashes. They happen like erosion, and that's why most people won't see this coming until they look back and wonder when everything changed. The dollar-sterling transition took 30 to 50 years depending on how you measure it, with the US overtaking Britain as the world's largest economy in the 1870s, becoming the leading creditor nation after World War I in 1918, and formally displacing sterling at Bretton Woods in 1944. Recent scholarship by economists Barry Eichengreen and Mark Flandreau suggests the dollar actually overtook sterling in reserves by the mid-1920s, which was faster than the conventional narrative, but still a process measured in decades rather than years. Sterling's reserve share fell from approximately 55% in 1950 to around 10% by 1970, which is a 20-year collapse. But notice that most people during that time didn't experience it as a collapse. They experienced it as a series of devaluations, a series of crises, a series of IMF conditions that each made life a bit harder, made imports a bit more expensive, made the currency in their pocket worth a bit less without any single moment where everything fell apart. The IMF cautions that much of the recent statistical decline in the dollar reflects exchange rate movements rather than active reserve reallocation, because when adjusted for currency effect, the dollar's share decreased only 0.12 percentage points in the second quarter of 2025. The decline from 71% to 57% over 25 years averages approximately half a percentage point annually, which looks like gradual erosion rather than collapse if you're only watching the numbers. What the statistics don't capture are the qualitative shifts though. The weaponization of dollar sanctions, with over 10,000 sanctions imposed on Russia since 2022 and approximately $300 billion in Russian reserves frozen, has fundamentally changed how other countries think about dollar dependence, and the development of alternative payment systems like CIPS and BRICS represents structural change that statistics may not yet fully capture. Most people won't see it coming because they're looking for a crash. They're looking for a specific day when the dollar ends. But that's not how reserve currency transitions work. Is 2026 the end of the dollar in a literal sense? No, the dollar will still exist and will still be used for decades to come. The era of unquestioned dollar dominance though, the ability to run unlimited deficits without consequences, the ability to use sanctions without creating alternatives, the exorbitant privilege of being the world's reserve currency, that era is ending whether Americans want to admit it or not. The most likely scenario, according to serious economists, is what they call multipolarity, which means a gradual evolution toward a system where dollar, euro, yuan, and perhaps gold or digital currencies share reserve functions rather than any single currency collapsing. Not dollar collapse, but the end of sole dominance, which sounds less dramatic, but matters just as much for your purchasing power and America's ability to finance its deficits. The timeline remains highly uncertain, with bearish experts predicting crisis within the decade, while institutions see gradual adjustment over 20 to 30 years. But what we know from history is that these transitions accelerate once confidence cracks. Confidence is built on things like fiscal discipline, manufacturing strength, trade balances, and not weaponizing your currency against everyone who disagrees with you. The British precedent is clear. Empires that debase their currencies, accumulate unsustainable debts, lose manufacturing competitiveness, and overextend militarily eventually lose financial primacy. Britain made those mistakes and lost its reserve currency status. America is making those mistakes now. The difference is that most Americans won't recognize it's happening until they look back and wonder when everything changed. Just like the British in 1976 looking at their IMF bailout and wondering how the world's greatest empire ended up begging for help. The signs are all around us right now. The question isn't whether history is repeating. The question is whether we're paying attention to what the decline of a reserve currency actually looks like while it's happening.